When a racist cop stops a black man on the street convinced he's up to no good, tensions rise. But what happens when the cop's assumptions are shattered, forcing him to confront a truth he never saw coming? The story unfolds in a powerful moment of reckoning. Marcus Williams, a black man in his early 30s, walks slowly down the quiet suburban street, his steps steady but fatigued. He had just finished a long day at work and was eager to get home. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with a soft orange hue as the cool evening air brushed against his skin. Despite the exhaustion, Marcus felt a sense of contentment. His day had gone well, and the comfort of his small home awaited him, just a few blocks away. The neighborhood, nestled on the outskirts of the city, had a reputation for being peaceful and well-kept, its tree-lined streets dotted with manicured lawns and cozy homes. Families waved at each other from their porches, and children's laughter filled the air during the day. It was the kind of place where, for the most part, people were kind and knew each other by name. Yet despite its charm, the neighborhood also harbored undercurrents of bias that were more deeply rooted than many realized. Among those biases was Officer Davis, a middle-aged white police officer who patrolled the streets. Known for his hardened views, Davis had built a reputation in the community for his quick judgments, particularly when it came to black residents. He was the type of cop who, whether consciously or not, seemed to take an extra interest in black men walking through the neighborhood, often stopping them for no reason other than his own prejudices. His assumptions about who belonged and who didn't were clear, and tonight, as Marcus walked home, Officer Davis was patrolling the very same streets. As Marcus approached his block, he noticed a police car slowly trailing him from behind. The car's headlights were dimmed and the engine hummed quietly, but there was no mistaking the presence of the officer. Marcus had lived in this neighborhood for years and knew the routine by now. He tried not to tense up, but something about the way the car followed him made his heart beat a little faster. Without any warning, the car's sirens flashed on, and Officer Davis's voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Marcus froze. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home after a long day at work. He turned to face the officer, trying to keep his movements calm and deliberate. Officer Davis, a middle-aged white cop with a permanent scowl, stepped out of the vehicle. "What's going on here, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but polite. "You tell me," Davis replied sharply, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. "What are you doing here walking down this street at this time of night?" Marcus blinked, his confusion morphing into frustration. "I'm walking home from work," he said, gesturing toward the nearby buildings. "I live just a few blocks away." Officer Davis didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed. "You look suspicious. You don't belong here." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He had heard them before, in various forms, from different people over the years. Just another form of racial profiling. But hearing it from an officer of the law made it sting in ways that were impossible to ignore. Still, he didn't flinch. He knew that reacting impulsively could make things worse, so he kept his composure. "I'm just walking home, officer. I'm not doing anything wrong." Davis took a step closer, almost in Marcus's face now. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he barked. His tone was aggressive, as if Marcus had already committed some crime. "What's your name? Where are you coming from? I've been around here long enough to know when something's off. And you look off." Marcus could feel the heat of the officer's gaze, his presence invading his personal space. He knew what this was. The officer wasn't asking for ID because there was a legitimate reason. He was simply trying to provoke a reaction. "I already told you, I'm walking home. I don't need to show you anything," Marcus said firmly, though he could feel his pulse quickening. "I live here. You can check my address if you need to." Davis ignored his words and kept pressing. "You're lying. I know when someone's up to something. Just tell me what you're doing here. Don't make me arrest you for obstruction." The officer's voice dripped with condescension, and Marcus could hear the thinly veiled threat. Davis wasn't trying to protect the community or enforce any kind of legitimate law. He was acting on a preconception based solely on Marcus's appearance. Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had faced this treatment countless times before, being stopped for no reason, treated like a criminal simply for existing. It was the reality of being black in a society where assumptions were made based on skin color, and the police force often served as the enforcers of those biases. He swallowed the rising anger in his chest and took a slow, steady breath. He wasn't going to give in to the officer's provocation. He had been here before, and he knew what was at stake. "I'm not lying, officer. I'm just walking home from work. I've done nothing wrong," Marcus repeated calmly, his voice unwavering. Davis glared at him, but something in Marcus's demeanor seemed to give him pause, if only for a second. The officer's gaze flickered briefly, perhaps realizing the futility of his accusation. But that moment of doubt didn't last long. He immediately returned to his confrontational stance, demanding that Marcus produce his identification. "I'm not showing you my ID," Marcus said again, his voice firm. "I'm not going to let you harass me just because of the color of my skin." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Davis's expression hardened. But Marcus held his ground, refusing to back down. His stance remained steady, and he knew that the officer's behavior wasn't about justice, it was about power, and the assertion of dominance over someone who didn't fit the officer's idea of what belonged. The tension between Marcus and Officer Davis was palpable, like a tightrope that could snap at any moment. The officer's behavior had escalated quickly from suspicion to outright hostility, and Marcus felt the weight of each word, each accusation. The officer's presence loomed large over him, an intimidating force designed to provoke, to challenge, to break him. But Marcus was determined not to give in. As Marcus remained firm, his posture upright and calm, the officer's frustration grew. Officer Davis's face flushed, and his grip on his baton tightened. His eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus's every movement, looking for any sign of resistance, any excuse to escalate the situation. "Don't make me call for backup, boy," Davis sneered, his voice low and threatening. "I'm not going to let you make this difficult." Marcus swallowed hard. He had seen this play out before. An officer with no valid reason to stop him, but desperate to make a point. He could feel his patience wearing thin, but he refused to give the officer any more reason to turn this into a confrontation. He had learned long ago that retaliation, even in the form of words, could escalate things in dangerous ways. "No need for backup," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though he could feel his pulse quickening. "I'm just trying to go home." The officer ignored his response, already dialing in the radio on his shoulder. His call for backup came out in clipped tones, a sharp, commanding order. "Possible obstruction. I need another unit here now." The words sent a ripple of unease through the air. Neighbors who had been quietly observing the encounter from their windows now began to gather on their porches, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding on their street. Some had already picked up on the tension, their gazes flickering with recognition. Others, more oblivious to the deeper issues at play, simply watched in silence, their judgment apparent in the quiet whispers that rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt the weight of their eyes on him. He had never wanted to be the center of attention, but today it seemed unavoidable. He could hear the murmurs from behind him, the soft rustling of curtains, the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet against concrete. It felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Marcus knew that, to them, this wasn't just about him. It was about a black man standing up to an officer, a moment that could either reinforce their own biases or challenge them. He had no intention of being a pawn in this game, but the more Davis talked, the more the officer's prejudices bubbled to the surface. "You know," Davis continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "it's people like you who are causing problems around here. You don't belong walking through this neighborhood at night, looking the way you do." The racial overtones in his words were unmistakable, and Marcus could feel his patience starting to fray at the edges. He had heard it all before. The subtle suggestion that he, by virtue of his skin color, didn't belong in certain places, that he was out of place, even when he was simply going about his business. But still, he refused to bite. His parents had raised him to walk with dignity, to remain calm in the face of ignorance. He wasn't going to let Officer Davis reduce him to the stereotype he was so desperate to impose. "I don't know what you think you know about me, officer," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I live here. I'm just walking home. I'm not a criminal." Davis, though, didn't seem to hear him. The officer had already made up his mind, and nothing Marcus said was going to change that. "All you black men, you all look the same to me," he muttered, barely above a whisper, as if the words were nothing more than a casual observation. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He had dealt with this before, but every time it happened, it stung. Davis wasn't just targeting him as an individual, he was using his uniform to blanket every black man as a threat. He could feel the anger building inside, but he knew he couldn't let it show. If he did, this would escalate into something he couldn't control. And just when Marcus thought things couldn't get worse, a car pulled up to the curb, its engine softly purring. The door swung open and a man stepped out, his posture straight and confident. "Hey, Marcus," the man called, a friendly grin spreading across his face. "How you doing, brother?" Marcus's face lit up with recognition. It was Carl Thompson, a local veteran who had known Marcus for years. Carl had served in the military, and though their paths had crossed only a few times, Marcus always appreciated Carl's friendly presence in the community. He had never seen the man as anything but a brother, someone who understood the struggles that came with being black in America. Carl approached the officer, his hand extended in greeting, but Davis looked him up and down with a dismissive glance. "What's going on here?" Carl asked, his voice warm but edged with concern. "Everything all right?" Marcus nodded, but his eyes flickered to Davis. He could see the officer's confusion, the way Davis hesitated, unsure of who Carl was. It was clear the officer hadn't recognized him and had no idea of the role Carl played in this community. "Everything's fine," Marcus said, trying to reassure Carl. "Just another misunderstanding." Carl, sensing the tension, addressed Davis directly. "Hey man, you got a problem with Marcus here?" Davis sneered, his tone dismissive. "I'm just doing my job, nothing to see here." Carl raised an eyebrow, his smile fading. "You might want to think about that, officer," he said coolly. "Marcus here, he's a war hero. You know, served in multiple combat zones, got medals for bravery." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Davis's eyes widened in disbelief, his gaze flicking between Marcus and Carl. "A war hero?" Davis repeated, clearly taken aback. He had no idea what to do with the information, his mind whirring. The man he had been dismissing, the man he had been ready to arrest, wasn't just some ordinary civilian. He was someone who had fought for this country, someone whose actions in war had been recognized. Marcus remained silent, the weight of Carl's words sinking in. It was a moment that felt both surreal and validating. This man, whom Davis had assumed to be a criminal simply because of his appearance, was in fact a decorated war hero. And now Officer Davis had no choice but to confront that truth. Davis's posture shifted, his confidence cracking. The swagger he had walked in with was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable, awkward stance. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He had been caught in a lie, his assumptions about Marcus shattered by the very person he had sought to undermine. Carl crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Now you might want to rethink the way you treat people, officer. You've been wrong about Marcus from the start. Maybe now you'll start seeing him for who he really is." Davis shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet either man's gaze. The realization that he had unjustly targeted Marcus, that he had judged him based solely on his skin color, was beginning to sink in. For the first time, Officer Davis felt the sting of his own prejudices and the reality of what they had cost him. The street was unusually quiet as the weight of the moment settled in. The lingering hum of distant traffic was the only sound breaking the silence. Officer Davis stood frozen, the words Carl had just spoken echoing in his mind. "Marcus here. He's a war hero." His grip tightened around the radio in his hand, his thoughts racing. He had been so sure, so quick to judge, to assume the worst. It wasn't just about the stop anymore. It wasn't just about who Marcus was on the outside. It was about the deeply ingrained biases that had led him to make a decision based on nothing but skin color and appearance. The assumption that because Marcus was a black man walking through a neighborhood Davis thought he didn't belong in, he was guilty of something, anything. But Carl's words had stopped him cold. Marcus was a war hero. He hadn't just been a witness to the violence and chaos of the world. He had faced it head on. He had fought for this country, risked his life, earned medals. And yet, here Davis was, accusing him of something far worse, being a criminal simply because of his race. Davis's mouth felt dry. He opened it to say something, anything to redeem himself, but the words caught in his throat. His voice came out hesitant, faltering. I, I didn't know, he muttered, his eyes dropping to the pavement, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Carl stood still beside Marcus, his arms crossed over his chest, a quiet observer to the unfolding moment. His voice, when he spoke, was deliberate, as if he were trying to impart some wisdom on the officer. Does it really take a medal to get treated with respect in this town? Do you need to see a piece of paper to realize that a person deserves the same dignity you'd show anyone else? Davis, still floundering, glanced from Carl to Marcus. The words he had planned to say, the justification he had been ready to offer, no longer seemed adequate. Apologizing felt weak, but it was all he had. The truth was undeniable now. He had misjudged Marcus, assumed the worst of him without a single reason to. And now there was no way to take back what he'd said or done. Davis trailed off, looking around as though searching for some escape from the discomfort of the situation. He cleared his throat, trying again. I'm sorry, Marcus. I, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have assumed. Marcus didn't allow him to finish. He stood tall, his posture unwavering, his voice calm and composed. It's too late for apologies, officer, Marcus said, his words cutting through the air with quiet authority. You don't get to erase what happened just because you made a mistake. You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed I was something I'm not. Davis swallowed hard, but Marcus wasn't finished. I'm not angry, but I am disappointed, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else treat me like I'm less than because of the color of my skin. I've earned the right to be treated with respect, just like everyone else, and that doesn't change based on your assumptions. His voice never rose above a steady tone, but every word was filled with a quiet strength that made the officer shift uncomfortably on his feet. Marcus wasn't angry, he wasn't lashing out, but the weight of his words was undeniable. It was a lesson Davis would never forget. A low murmur began to spread through the crowd of neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold from their windows and porches. Slowly, people began to step forward, their eyes now full of respect for Marcus. It wasn't just the veteran, Carl, standing by his side anymore. The community, silent until now, had begun to show its support. An older woman, her face set in a stern but compassionate expression, stepped forward from her house, nodding toward Marcus. She didn't say a word, but her presence, standing in solidarity with him, spoke volumes. A man in his late 40s, a father of 2 young children, walked toward them, shaking his head with disapproval as he caught Davis's eye. One by one, the neighbors came forward, not to shout or protest, but to stand next to Marcus in silence. They didn't need to say anything to make their point. The officer could feel the shift in the air, a collective acknowledgement of Marcus's right to be treated with dignity and respect. Their support was palpable, and it was something Davis couldn't ignore. Davis shifted uncomfortably, realizing that what he had once considered an authority over the situation had now slipped from his grasp. He was humiliated. He had been exposed, not just to Marcus, but to the entire community, which had now witnessed his shameful behavior firsthand. There was no turning back from this. His reputation was shattered, and the damage he had done to Marcus could never be undone. In that moment, Officer Davis's mind was a whirlwind. His internal struggle was impossible to ignore. He had always believed himself to be a good man, someone who enforced the law fairly. But the reality of what had just happened, the realization that his assumptions about Marcus had been wrong, forced him to confront his own biases. How had he gotten here? How had he allowed himself to believe that a man could be guilty simply because of his skin color? Davis felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, and for the first time, he understood the far-reaching consequences of his prejudices. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a pattern, a deep-seated belief system that he had been living with for years, and now it was staring him in the face, unavoidable. The quiet murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and Davis's ears rang with the uncomfortable silence that had descended on him. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, some judgmental, some sympathetic, but all of them aware of the lesson that had been taught. This wasn't just about one black man and one white cop. It was a much larger story about race, power, and respect. And Davis, standing there, was forced to reckon with the truth of what he had done. His shoulders slumped, and he took a deep breath, as if trying to gather himself. But when he looked up, his eyes met Marcus's once more. And for the first time in his career, Officer Davis saw Marcus for who he truly was. Not a threat, not an assumption, but a man who had earned the right to be respected. As Marcus stood silently, the weight of the moment still settling around him, the community's response grew more apparent. The neighbors who had been silently watching the altercation from behind their windows and porches began to step forward one by one. The tension that had filled the air moments before now seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet strength in the form of solidarity. An elderly woman, her graying hair wrapped in a scarf, approached Marcus with a slight nod, her face stern but understanding. "We've seen it too many times," she said quietly, just loud enough for those around to hear. "You don't deserve this." Her words, though simple, carried weight. Slowly, others began to follow her lead. A middle-aged man, his hands in his pockets, walked forward with a firm expression. "It's about time someone said something," he muttered, addressing the officer, though his gaze remained on Marcus. "This kind of stuff happens all the time. We're tired of it." The murmurs grew louder, voices no longer hesitant but filled with the confidence that came from shared experience. They had all seen it, the way black men were treated differently in this neighborhood. They had all watched as Davis, time and again, seemed to target certain people based on little more than their skin color. And now, in the wake of Marcus's dignified confrontation, they were done staying silent. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to the growing crowd. He hadn't expected this. The power dynamic had completely shifted. What had started as his authority over the situation was now an undeniable display of collective resistance. These people weren't afraid anymore. They weren't going to let him get away with what he'd done. Marcus, however, wasn't interested in making this any more dramatic than it had to be. He knew that the moment had already shifted in his favor, and while the community rallied behind him, he remained steadfast in his quiet dignity. He didn't need to prove anything more to Officer Davis or anyone else. The lesson had already been delivered. With a single calm nod to the neighbors, Marcus turned away from the crowd, his footsteps steady as he walked down the street toward his home. There was no anger in his stride, no bitterness. He had made his point, and he knew it had been heard. As he walked, he could feel the eyes of the community on him, not with judgment, but with respect. The moment wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. Officer Davis, meanwhile, stood frozen, his body stiff as the weight of the situation sank in. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had assumed that his authority would simply silence Marcus. But now his entire sense of self was being questioned, not just by the man he had targeted, but by the very people he had vowed to serve and protect. The disapproving stares of the neighbors lingered on him like a heavy cloud, and Davis could feel the heat of shame spreading through his chest. Later that week, news of the incident began to circulate. It wasn't long before the local news outlets picked up on the altercation, and the public outcry was swift. It wasn't just the incident itself that raised eyebrows. It was the larger context of racial profiling that many had silently observed but never confronted. For days, the story dominated social media, and community leaders started to speak out, demanding accountability for Davis's actions. Davis, once so confident in his role, now found himself under an internal investigation. His department, facing mounting pressure from both the community and the media, had little choice but to act. What had begun as a simple incident on a quiet street had now become a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the officer who had so easily dismissed him. The investigation began in earnest. Davis was questioned about his conduct, and the department's leadership had to address the wider issue of racial bias within their own ranks. The investigation soon became the subject of heated debates within the department. Davis's colleagues, some of whom had silently observed his behavior for years, were now forced to reckon with the reality of what had transpired. Could they continue to let this kind of treatment slide? How many other people had been unfairly targeted by him, and by others who shared his views? Davis's reputation, once solid, was now in ruins. The community had spoken, and his actions had triggered a chain reaction that would be impossible to ignore. The pressure on him, both professionally and personally, became insurmountable. His personal life, too, began to unravel as his family and friends questioned his behavior. He was forced to confront the very prejudices that had guided his actions for so long. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to live his life, unwavering in his commitment to justice and equality. Though the incident had been a difficult one, he found strength in the support of his community. It was a bittersweet victory, one that had come at a personal cost. But Marcus understood that his dignity and resilience in the face of adversity had set an example for others. In the days that followed, people reached out to Marcus to express their respect. They came from all walks of life, friends, strangers, even local businesses, all offering words of encouragement. His strength had made a lasting impression, and his calm demeanor in the face of injustice became a model for others to follow. Marcus knew, though, that this wasn't the end. It was just a beginning. The fight for equality, for respect, was ongoing. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of collective hope. The community had stood with him, and in doing so, they had shown that change was possible. As Marcus reflected on the day's events, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over. The road to equality and justice would be long and filled with challenges, but Marcus knew that he had made a difference, and that was enough for now. As Marcus walked home that evening, the weight of the moment still lingered in the air, but it wasn't the anger or bitterness that weighed him down. Instead, it was a quiet sense of resolve, a deep understanding that the struggle for equality was ongoing, and that his role in it was far from over. Marcus had always believed that change came through actions, not words. He had learned early in life that getting angry or fighting fire with fire only deepened the divide. What truly mattered was dignity, the dignity to stand tall, to speak calmly in the face of adversity, to be a man who could inspire others without losing his composure. He knew that this incident with Officer Davis, while significant, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The work wasn't over, but Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose in his journey, a commitment to be an example for the younger generation, those who would come after him and continue the fight for justice. His role was to show them that dignity, respect, and patience were powerful tools in the fight against systemic racism. Every moment of grace was a step toward change. Meanwhile, Officer Davis had begun to wrestle with his own internal battles. The public humiliation and the growing pressure from his department had forced him to reconsider his views. The weight of what had happened, how he had unfairly targeted Marcus, how his prejudice had been exposed, stayed with him long after that day. It gnawed at him, making it impossible to ignore the deep-rooted biases he had harbored for so long. Davis started attending sensitivity training, though at first it felt more like a begrudging obligation than a genuine desire to change. But as time went on, the lessons began to sink in. He started engaging with the community in a way he never had before, listening to people, understanding their experiences, realizing that his job wasn't just to enforce the law, but to build trust and protect every citizen, regardless of their skin color. Months later, Marcus was honored for his service in a community event where his bravery as a decorated war hero was celebrated by the very people who had once quietly watched from the sidelines. But what was most significant that day wasn't just the recognition of his military service, it was the acknowledgement of his strength in the face of oppression. His courage wasn't only on the battlefield, it was in how he held himself in that moment with Officer Davis, how he stood firm against injustice without resorting to anger or violence. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus looked out over the crowd, surrounded by friends, family, and even people like Officer Davis, who now approached him with a genuine, respectful handshake. In that moment, Marcus understood something deeply important. His fight wasn't just for recognition, it was for the dignity of every person who had ever been wronged, and that he knew was something worth fighting for.